The latest update from ESPN's Jeff Darlington as it pertains to the Dolphins and Tua Tagovailoa is, well, not great. We're going to talk about it here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Cal Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. I appreciate you guys checking out the show. You can find us on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tip of the cap to our everydayers, because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase on last-minute tickets with lowest prices. Guaranteed. I was really excited to not do a Tua Tagovailoa contract update show this week. And I had like this really great content series, and we're still going to run it. It's just going to run a day later. Looking back at the 2024 Miami Dolphins offseason blueprint, which if you're not familiar, if you're new to the channel, welcome. But the offseason blueprint is like my mock offseason that I do contract decisions. I do player personnel decisions and roster cuts and free agency and the mock draft and a 53-man roster projection. And like looking back at all the things that the first week in March coming out of the NFL Combine, I said, look, here's kind of what, like based on what we think direction they're going to go, like what I think they could get accomplished, and then compare and contrast that to what they actually get accomplished. And like, it's really fun and really interesting results this year to look back over what I had drawn up, what I was able to assemble with trying to be conservative with projections to make sure you're getting something realistic and not just like a fantasy Madden output. And we'll do it. But then Jeff Darlington went on NFL Live yesterday and provided the not rosy update on where things stand with a contract negotiation with Tua Tagovailoa and the Miami Dolphins. And I said, well, Kyle, if you're going to do a daily Dolphins show, especially in the end of June when everybody's hungry for news and not just opinion-based stuff or analysis that's for stuff that's going to be happening 6-8 weeks from now, you should probably do a show on Jeff Darlington's update about Tua Tagovailoa. So Jeff Darlington, and I'll say this, there's very few people from a Miami Dolphins-centric point of view whose opinion and reporting I would care about more about the Dolphins than Jeff Darlington. Very well connected with the team, outstanding reporter, deserves all of the flowers that he gets as he continues to grow on the national stage and become more and more prominent. Outstanding at what he does and very relevant with the news that he is able to report as it pertains to Miami. Well, he has thus far this offseason been very optimistic and adamant that like, yes, this is going to get done. He's the one who had the quote that said, everybody has kind of decided, everybody's on the same page that this is their quarterback moving forward. It's just a matter of getting the details confirmed. And it sounds like this latest update is kind of a embodiment of what happens when you wait, right? Jeff Darlington previously said that quote, everybody's on the same page. Everybody has decided Tua Tagovailoa is going to be the quarterback of the Miami Dolphins for like a long-term perspective. And I'm paraphrasing what he said there, but that was the spirit of what he said. Yesterday he goes on NFL Live and says, I have to scale back my optimism that a contract extension will get done right now, based on right now where we understand the negotiations are. Quote, right now, the Dolphins are not offering the contract that is the market value. Based on my conversations, they are not in the Jared Goff and Trevor Lawrence ballpark. Well, what's changed, right? Those contracts have happened since the beginning of the offseason, and a lot of Jeff Darlington's understanding, you would presume, before those contracts are finalized is based off of the conversation he has before those contracts are finalized. That's how it usually works. These numbers of these new deals have only further complicated the negotiations between the two sides. And the unfortunate reality with that is you waited. And if you are still committed long-term to Tua Tagovailoa being the quarterback of this team for 2024, 2025, 2026, and probably at a minimum 2027, your outlook for getting that done has been changed by other teams. And the Dolphins could theoretically say, and we'll talk about this with the rest of the show, well, we're not going to have our price dictated for our quarterback in our system based off of what Jacksonville decided and what they wanted to base their price on their quarterback in their system for relative to the accolades and accomplishments of each respective player. You can respect that, right? And I think the thing that's important to remember, there's a few things that are important to remember here. But if the perspective of the end result has not changed, what I think that does is I think that kind of sets the stage for one of a few things to happen. And we're going to go into what all of those potential outcomes are. But I will say this off the very start. Miami needs to be careful here. Tua's already kind of alluded to the dynamics of the negotiations and how he has taken that personally, not taking it necessarily personally, but understanding that it's a business thing. But he's had a hard time compartmentalizing the business side of negotiations from everything else. And he said, if you're somebody that can do that, that's great. But, for me, that's not really how I handle that kind of stuff. This, especially if it plays out in the public space, can be a very not fun game to be played. And you can look across some other guys across the league. Lamar Jackson comes to mind. He was somebody who had to get the franchise tag. And they were looking at, do we have to trade Lamar Jackson? Non-exclusive tag. Is anybody going to negotiate with him? That got very ugly. They ultimately end up getting a contract extension done. Lamar wins the MVP in the first year after that contract. So that's not to say once it's done, it can't be water under the bridge. But this is a very high-profile player for a team that has become a high-profile team, and everybody's got an opinion on it. And the public opinion court can make this much more stressful as this process plays out. And for Miami's side of things, if they do draw it out longer, the end results inevitably, regardless of what the final determination is, it's going to be you cost yourself more money. And if you're comfortable with that, and we'll talk about that, okay, that's fine. But I go back to what Jeff Darlington said at the beginning of the offseason, which is everybody's on the same page and has decided what the future of the quarterback position looks like for the Dolphins. And if that is true, you guys are on the clock. Jeff Darlington also said he wouldn't be surprised if Jordan Love got his contract extension done before Tua and Miami, which would only further complicate the matter. So we're going to talk about Miami's side of the fence as far as where they're at, how they're handling this, what their kind of business modus operandus is as far as status quo, and compare and contrast that to how they're handling the quarterback negotiations with Tua Tagovailoa. That's next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. Passion, drive, and patience are not just the formula for winning championships. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive. With eBay Motors, they have everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber and not cash. Bring home all the parts you need at the prices you want. It's easy to make your car the MVP. Bring home the dub with eBay Motors. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. eBay Guarantee Fit available only to U.S. customers. So, as I reflect on how Miami has kind of handled every contract negotiation that they have, period. They are very methodical with how they conduct themselves, then we've seen this pay itself off for good and also for bad. In all the Christian Wilkins negotiations, everybody carries the scar tissues for a player that you loved, that you wanted to see a contract extension get done, but the Dolphins weren't willing to bend beyond the point of where they were comfortable doing so, and Christian Wilkins walks in free agency. It leaves a bad taste in everybody's mouth. But the other side of that coin is contract extensions like Zach Sealer and Jalen Waddle's most recent. The thing that I go back to with Jalen Waddle, overthecap.com has the updated Jalen Waddle contract figures. And Waddle carries salary cap hits in each of the next 3 years of like 9.2, 8.06, and $11 million is the salary cap space for each of the next 3 seasons for Jalen Waddle on a $28 million year contract extension, right? Like, his salary cap hit in 2027 is less than Tyreek Hill's salary cap hit this year. It's an outstanding contract for Miami, but they weren't the first to get it done. They kind of let the market declare itself. And if we're going to sit here and give the Dolphins flowers for getting these contracts that are routinely constructed in a way and structured in a way that give you flexibility, there's good distribution of cash flow, but also cap distribution and cap flexibility to be able to have exit ramps at certain times in these contracts, all these things that we talk about, that's like, hey, Miami has a lot of strategy levers they can pull with just about every contract that's on the books. If we're going to sit here and give them their flowers for that and heap praise at them for that style and approach, you have to understand the downside to that is getting a lot of those contracts done early and first is probably not going to happen because they're more complex contracts. There's more complex layers to how they structure the deals instead of saying, okay, you get a salary of X, Y, and Z for years A, B, and C, and that's it. And then we'll cross that bridge when we get there if we want to do something with it. Like, that's not how they've handled a lot of this. There's a lot of stipulated money, and there's a lot of incentives, and there's a lot of structured bonuses within as part of your salary distributions. And that into a quarterback contract with the magnitude of how much money you're talking about, it's a lot of work. And then what I would guess what has happened is they probably felt pretty good about where they were at. And then these other contracts happen. And you say, okay, we'll go back to square one and we'll do it over again. And you build it back up. And then the Trevor Lawrence thing happens. And it's like, okay, it completely takes the wind out of the sails of a lot of these negotiations. I would assume some of that has happened. It is an assumption on my part, but it's reading between the lines as far as the tone and the messaging from everybody involved. And it is interesting that Jeremy Fowler has recently come out and said, like, they're in the same ballpark. So there's a couple different ways in which they cannot be on the same page. It can be the total value of the contract. I think that's the easiest one to solve. I would assume it's the distribution and the stipulations of the guaranteed money, as far as fully guaranteed at signing, guaranteed for injury, like all that kind of stuff. For Tua, it is a more complicated case because of Tua's injury history. And that's where I think for Miami, this methodical approach that what they have, and I think in a lot of ways it's good, but there are ways in which it is bad, and it's a double-edged sword that you have to take the good and the bad with. It's like Mike McDaniel from a play calling perspective, right? It's like Tua as a player. It's like every player and every element of everything. There are pros and cons to it, and the way that the Dolphins, from a football operations standpoint, handle structuring contracts and negotiations, this is the downside of it. The longer it goes, the more money you ultimately potentially cost yourself. And when it's a contract of this magnitude, it is felt so much more. And Tua says that he's antsy, and I know the fan base is antsy. I know there's some fans that want to get a contract done yesterday and they don't care what it is. I know there's some fans that would say, let him play out the 5th-year option and go from there and figure it out. And what I would say to that is if cost is not an issue, okay, then you could say, look, we're going to have our best offer out. We'll do the thing that Mike Florio keeps talking about and say, we're going to get to training camp. We're going to say, here's our best offer, and do the thing you did with Christian Wilkins and be like, we really want you to take it. We hope you take it, but this is what we're offering. And we're not going to keep you-know-whatting into the wind about it. Yes or no? And then if that doesn't happen, then you can play out the 5th-year option and then get into next season. And I've already done the math. I'm not a math guy, but I am a kind of a cap guy, right? I have my own table in addition to what you have with Over the Cap and SpotRack.com as far as like multi-year salaries and contracts for the Dolphins from a salary cap perspective. The projected 2025 franchise tag, if you had to go that route and you're like, okay, well, we still want you long-term, but we haven't figured this out yet, but we don't want to let you test the market and therefore risk you signing with someone else. So we're going to franchise tag you. They can do it. The ease in which they do it is a different conversation entirely because they do have a couple of notable players that are coming off the books, like Javon Holland, like David Long. Those are kind of the two in their physical prime or coming into their physical prime, as in Javon's case, stand out like quality starter or plus. I have Javon graded as a cornerstone, and I have David Long graded as a quality starter for the Dolphins. So like those are two bigger pieces defensively for you. Now, they're not premium positions. So like paying Javon top of market dollar or in the ballpark of top of market dollar or a competitive contract, depending on where on that spectrum his play leads him this year, is going to be cheaper than doing it with an offensive tackle or an edge rusher or a wide receiver. And maybe you feel a little bit better that that's more easily achieved. And same thing for linebackers, right? Like top of market linebackers, there's not a lot that are getting up above like $12 million. And I don't think David's in that stratosphere right now with where he's at anyway. But those are players that you'd have your hands full, and then you have to field a rest of roster, and you have a lot of players on one-year deals that if you're tying up $40-something million in a franchise tag, it can get messy. It can be very restrictive. I think it's more realistic, though, that if push came to shove, right? And there's a lot of forecasting 8 months out right now because everybody's mind goes to the worst case scenario, and that's that no contract extension gets done. He plays this year on the 5th-year option, and then you're looking at him potentially testing free agency. And if the season goes well, you think you're going to have to offer a lot of money right now. Make him play this year out, and he plays really well, and he answers some of the other questions that exist on his resume, and then wait and see what that price tag looks like, right? That's getting into playing with fire. You do have the franchise tag to fall back on, though, is my point. And I think it's more realistic for the franchise tag to be an option at quarterback for Tua next year than it was based on the Dolphins salary cap situation for the franchise tag to be an option for Christian Wilkins this year. Because I've done the numbers. And with the Wilkins thing, you're looking at it and you're like, look, they can move all this stuff around, but they're starting $40 million in the hole with what they have to maneuver and work around. You could franchise tag Christian, probably have like $12 million in cap space otherwise to work with until the post June 1st money clears. And like what realistically, how active are you going to be with that? Depending on what levers they pull, and they still have to resolve the Tyreek Hill contract. They still have to, they'll have a decision after the season as far as how to handle Bradley Chubb. They restructured a part of his salary this year, and that did leave a potential exit strategy for Bradley Chubb after this season, depending on how Chop Robinson does and what Jalen Phillips looks like, and so on and so forth, right? Like they'll have options in the edge room is my point. You can pull levers, cut a couple players that you kind of have some players in the pipeline for. You probably need to get lucky and have a Teron Armstead decision to restructure his contract and then ultimately like potentially retire. Like that's your biggest pathway to savings for Teron for this upcoming season. And you could have about $20 million in salary cap space with the franchise tag after you exhausted all of your options. So it's more than what it would have been this year with Christian. But do you want to do that? No, I don't think that's a particularly attractive option because of what it means for some other player decisions that you're going to have to make and you want to make and be able to potentially bring those guys back. So this is risky business that the Dolphins are pushing themselves into here. We'll talk a little bit more about that next year on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. I was so fired up to not talk about this because I'm like so many of you. It's like I just want it. I want it done one way or another, right? Because I cover the Miami Dolphins. I don't cover the Miami Tagovailoas. And I know that's the cost of having a player of Tua's profile with what he was in college and being a first-round pick and the Tank for Tua campaign and now being a polarizing, but in a lot of ways successful NFL player. It's kind of the nature of the beast, right? The market is the market as it pertains to covering your team in the NFL. But I think the way that I have kind of settled on this outcome is your floor for quarterback play long-term is Tua. That's your floor because Miami will have plenty of options, whether it's getting a long-term contract extension done at before training camp or after before the start of the season, letting him play out the fifth-year option, and then utilizing the franchise tag to lock him in, or alternatively, letting him play out the fifth-year option and getting to kind of the horizon of next offseason and surveying and looking around and say, okay, what are our options as far as, is there anybody that we like more than Tua that's available? And I'm not going to answer that question because like there's so many things that could or could not happen, but like they will have the opportunity to either get the deal done now if they are fully committed, or they'll say, well, this is our offer. If you don't take it, we're going to let the year play out. And then either assess, hey, you played well, we want to get something done. Let's either franchise tag you or get the contract done and pay the money that we've cost ourselves by letting this process play out. Or they're going to say, hey, if this is the stratosphere of spending that we're going to be in, who do you want to spend it on that's going to be available? And if they don't pick Tua, you would assume they would like somebody else more than Tua. So my floor is it's a market contract, and the floor of the performance is Tua Tagovailoa. They're not going to let Tua walk and like not have a plan because they have enough leverage to secure his services if the alternative is Mike White and a rookie, right? Like they're not that's not. This team is too aggressive. They're too willing to spend. They're in the midst of a window. They've worked a long time to position themselves as a team to be in a stratosphere, to be in the air of the NFL that they're in. And if it's, we'll just draft a guy and figure it out. Like I don't foresee that being a highly realistic outcome for Miami to just put anybody there. They will, at a worst case scenario, get through this season and say, who do we like the best relative to the cost that it's going to take? And they did that with Christian Wilkins, right? And I'm not saying that that's going to happen with Tua, but like, if you choose to do it that way, you're going to pay significantly more than what you would if you were going to pay Tua now. So the risk in playing with fire is if you choose to play it that way and you get to the end of the rainbow in 2025 at the beginning of the offseason and you say, well, shoot, the guy we like the most is Tua. So now we got to commit to Tua like we were talking about doing in June and July, and the price has gone up, right? Like that's the fire that you're playing with. But I don't think the risk is you're facing this dramatic downgrade at the position. And there's a lot of people out there who have a lot of different opinions on Tua. Some of them which think, there's a lot of upgradable opportunities with Tua. To that, I would say if you wanted to stylistically change how you play offensively with this staff and with this offense and with this team, um, if you're going to transition, you would need to see who's available as well. But that's not going to be cheap either. If you think bidding right now just for Tua as a starting quarterback for your system, and Miami's leverage is probably they know it is such a unique and tailored fit that the appeal elsewhere, and we did this show, we said, is Miami bidding against themselves? I think there's enough other contenders where like it could get dicey for you and uncomfortable for you if he hit the open market. But Miami's, I think, biggest leverage play is like, look, we've catered a lot of what we do to you. There's an inherent value here for you that somebody else would have to spend years crafting like we have. And because of that, as we want to make you what we perceive as a fair offer of your value, we recognize that this is not an off the rack suit, right? This is a tailored fit from the coaching staff to the run game style, to the passing game concepts, to the skill players around you. And like, that's all true. And are there limitations within that? Sure. Is there ways that it can get better from an execution standpoint, both quarterback and otherwise? Absolutely. We'll see what happens. Right. But I think that's the lasting impression that I want to leave with everybody before we go back to our regularly scheduled content for the week is just know the floor long-term for your quarterback play is Us and Uno. That's the floor. And anything the Dolphins do otherwise, it's either going to come back to Tua with more money or it's going to be somebody who they perceive is better. And say what you will about Tua, I would say there's not a lot of options out there that are better than Tua Tagovailoa. That's going to do it for us here today on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. I appreciate you guys checking out the show. Make it a great rest of your day. Fins up. I am out of here.